Welcome to this first public forum in the Harold Burson Leadership Series. Its purpose is to explore the issues that affect our world relating to the media, communications, public affairs, and public relations. The first forum, as you know, is the topic of anti-Americanism, how it arose, what its effects are, and what we can do to reverse the trend. Our purpose, of course, is to try to create awareness and understanding of the issue through public discussion and the sharing of expert insights, suggestions, and alternatives. This forum is the first activity of the newly established Harold Burson Chair of Public Relations. The aim of this chair is to further communications, the communications profession, and help create new leaders in the area of public affairs and public relations. The topic of anti-Americanism is appropriate because the foundation of public relations is public opinion. This was brought out very sharply in an article that some of you may have seen in the New York Times today. It's called U.S. Must Counteract Image in Muslim World, panel says. I'll just read the first paragraph here. The United States must drastically increase and overhaul its public relations efforts to salvage its plummeting image among Muslim and Arabs abroad. A panel chosen by the Bush administration has found. The study is called Hostility Toward America, and it has reached shocking levels. The report added that spin and manipulative public relations are not the answer, but neither is the avoidance of debate. So we're going to indeed start a debate on the subject of anti-Americanism and its many manifestations. We have a uniquely qualified panel of experts that you see in front of you. Andrew Kohut may look familiar to some of you as he did to me because he often appears on the Lara news show talking about and reporting on public opinion and also giving some splendid insights as to how to interpret the findings. He's the co-author of a new study called Global Attitudes Toward America, and I'm sure he's going to be telling you the major findings of this. He was president of the Gallup organization from 1979 to 1989. He's written many books, holds many honors. He will be reviewing, he'll provide the foundation for this panel by reporting on the major findings, and then he'll join with the rest of the panel in discussing the findings. Ray Offenheiser, who's sitting next to him, is president of Oxfam America. Before that, he worked for the Ford Foundation in Bangladesh and South America. He worked for the Inter-American Foundation in both Brazil and Colombia, and for Save the Children Federation in Mexico. I'm emphasizing the countries because all of our panelists have traveled extensively throughout the world. He's worked on projects of community-based resource management, credit and enterprise development, human rights and local governance, and international security and cooperation. Tonight, he particularly represents the voice of NGOs, non-governmental organizations, a voice for humanitarian and environmental values, and for the formation of a global civil society. Michael Hirsch is senior editor of Newsweek's Washington office and author of a book that has received much acclaim, At War with Ourselves, Why America is Squandering Its Chance to Build a Better World. He's appeared numerous times as a commentator on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and national radio. Formerly, he worked in the Tokyo office, so he's familiar with Japan. He's also written a distinguished article called China's Financial Revolutionaries, which profiles a new generation of mainland Chinese businessmen who are striving to build a capitalist financial system from scratch. He's also written extensively for Foreign Affairs, Harper's, and Washington Monthly. Bennett Freeman is Managing Director of Burson Marsteller's Corporate Responsibility Unit, and he is the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He was responsible for conducting the State Department's bilateral human relations diplomacy around the world. He also represented the U.S. government at the International Labor Organization in 1999 and worked on a wide range of labor rights issues around the world. He has advised multinationals, international institutions, and NGOs on corporate responsibility, human rights, and political risk issues. He will discuss issues dealing with trade and multinational corporations, labor, and human rights. Again, a person with wide international experience. Now, your program reads that Margaret Drain was to have been your moderator, but there was a tragic death in the family, and she obviously could not attend, but she has a very able colleague, Jeb Sharp, who was able in the last minute to take her place. Jeb Sharp is a foreign policy reporter for the public radio program The World, a co-production of BBC, Public Radio International, and WGBH Boston. Jeb, it's yours to explain the order of presentation. But before you do that, there are two announcements I want to make. And the first one gives me great pleasure because I've always been on the receiving side of it. If you have a cell phone, get rid of all those noises, because this panel is being taped by WGBH for future webcasting. It'll appear on the WGBH Forum Network at, and get your pencils ready, www.wgbh.org/forum. It's all yours.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you for those very kind introductions. So welcome once again to all of you. And basically my job is to keep this conversation moving, and I don't think I'll have any trouble at all. We've divided the evening into a couple of sections. Basically everybody will take a stab at the reality of anti-Americanism, and then we'll come back around and look at, well, what do we do about it? And there will be a chance at the end for questions from the floor, so please keep your thoughts and questions in mind as we go through, and you'll definitely have a chance to address them. So again, Andrew Kohut of the Pew Research Center, immediately on my left, will begin with some highlights from his global research on attitudes towards America. Ray Offenheiser of Oxfam will speak about what he calls global citizenship and emerging global civil society. Michael Hirsch of Newsweek will talk about U.S. foreign policy and international reaction to that policy. And finally, Bennett Freeman will talk about both the diplomatic and business perspectives on attitudes towards America. So I will hand it to Andrew.
I'm going to stand up and talk to you because I have some numbers that I want to read to you. What I will try to do is present the nature of the problem. And the surveys that the Pew Research Center conducted on behalf of the Pew Global Attitudes Project, perhaps more than any other effort, documented the nature of global anti-Americanism. I don't think anyone was surprised in the surveys that we conducted last year and this year that there was anti-Americanism, that it had increased, but the degree of anti-Americanism that we measured and expressed in our surveys is the surprise. We conducted 66,000 interviews in 49 countries over the past 14 months. The first wave of interviewing was last summer, and we did 38,000 interviews in 44 countries. And then after the war in Iraq in May, we conducted 16,000 interviews as a follow-up survey in 20 countries plus the Palestinian Authority. Let me try to do two things. I want to try to tell you about the nature of anti-Americanism and then tell you what our surveys found about the causes, and that perhaps will further the conversation about solutions. All right, here are the things to know about anti-Americanism. It's worldwide. This is not only a rift between America and its allies in Europe over Iraq, or hostility toward America among the Muslim publics of the world. The first survey that we did last summer, which had trend measures in 35 countries based upon surveys that the State Department had been doing in 1999 and 2000, found public favorability or favorable opinion of the United States slipping in most countries. So this is not just in a few places. It's in Africa and Asia and Latin America, and it's a global problem. Secondly, it's far worse in the Muslim world than elsewhere. But in 2002, before the war in Iraq, real dislike, if not hatred, of the United States was limited to the region of conflict. It was limited to the Mideast and Central Asia. It wasn't worldwide in terms of Muslim publics. What we found after the war in Iraq was that Muslims from Africa to Indonesia, not to mention the Mideast, all saw the United States as a threat to Islam. The percentage of people in, for example, Indonesia having a favorable opinion of the United States fell from 50%, which wasn't great in 2002, all the way down to 15% in 2003. And the survey that we reported in 2003 among the Muslim publics looked like a testimony to the clash of civilizations predicted by Samuel Huntington. A third thing I want you to know about this anti-Americanism is that unlike the past, when American policies were in disfavor, we also find the American people being less well-liked around the world. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. Americans aren't hated in Europe, and they're not hated in Latin America. But there's less of a positive view toward the people. And this is a measure, our people, which is a measure of the depths of the problem. Fourthly, I suspect that since our survey was conducted, probably attitudes toward America have improved somewhat. Tempers have cooled in Europe and much of the world. But I rather doubt that that was the case in the Mideast. There's real antipathy toward the United States in the Muslim world. Finally, understand the second headline from the Pew Global Attitude Survey, which said, even though the United States is less well-liked this year and last year, and its image is a problem, our ideas are accepted, if not triumphant, around the world. Liberal Western ideas about democracy and free market and even globalization have very, very broad acceptance, even in places that were not well-liked. And that has some important implications, I think, for discussion of solutions. Okay, why are we not liked? Well, in the Muslim world, there are four things that jump out. First of all, dislike of U.S. policies in the Mideast. That's the 800-pound gorilla. 80% of all of the Muslim publics, even the Kuwaitis, think were unfair. We even found 30% of the Israelis thinking were unfair. Secondly, the war on terrorism. The war on terrorism is seen by Muslim publics as the United States picking on Muslim countries and not a legitimate war on terrorism. We have a real problem with that. Thirdly, now Iraq. Iraq, as I said earlier, created the view that the United States represented. There's a growing threat to Islam in the world, and the United States is it. Finally, the one point I'd like to make is there's not wholesale rejection of American values in Muslim countries. Many of the things that we do and many of the things that we believe in are subscribed to by Muslim public. So it's not our values that they don't like. They don't like our policies. That's really important to understand. Looking at the world more broadly, the causes of anti-Americanism are as follows. The United States is seen as acting unilaterally. That was the case in 2002. It was even more the case after the war in Iraq, and it's the single most important driver of negative public opinion toward the United States. 2, the United States is seen as doing too little to deal with global problems. That's a worldview. It's not the view of the American public. Americans think we do too much to deal with global problems, not too little, if anything, although that attitude is changing a bit. Thirdly, U.S. policies are seen as adding to the problems of the rich-poor gap. That's a view that's even subscribed to in the United States. When we ask people all around the world, well, you hold an unfavorable view of the United States, those who did. Why is it? Is it the Bush administration, which has gotten very low grades in the polls that we've conducted, or is it a problem with America generally? And large majorities of the unfavorable groups said it was mostly Bush. Well, Dr. Gallup, when I was learning about public opinion polling, told me never to double think my respondents. But in this case, I will a little bit. I think that the problem of the United States is broader than discontent with Bush's policies. I think the administration's policies have brought us to a surface and intensified anti-American attitudes. But the real problem rests in the role that the United States plays in the world. And that role is the issue there is its unrivaled power. It's a power that breeds two things, suspicion and resentment. On the resentment front, it came home so clearly to us in the survey that we did after the 9/11 attacks, when people told us that they were so sympathetic to the people all around the world, said that their publics were so sympathetic to the victims of the 9/11 attacks. But large majorities said, most people in our country think it's good that the Americans know what it's like to be vulnerable. That's a measure of the resentment of American power. As to suspicion, there's no end of indicators of suspicion of our power. The large percentages of people who would say in one breath Saddam Hussein is a threat, people in Europe, for example, and in the next breath say the real reason the Americans want to do this is for oil. The books that are extremely popular in France and Germany that purport that the CIA or the United States set up or staged the 9/11 attacks are another non-survey indicator. There's real suspicion of our power because it is so great and it's so unrivaled. Europeans in particular used to take comfort in that power, particularly during the early days of the Cold War, because it provided protection from the Soviets. It's not comforting anymore. A second view, especially with regard to the Europeans, is that we have a different view about security and how to deal with our own defense. Europe is coming together to form a union, while Americans are more in favor of containment. They are much more likely than the Europeans to support preemption as an approach, and much less likely to demand multilateral efforts in the conduct of war. Thirdly is the globalization factor. Our surveys have shown very broad acceptance of American popular culture, songs, movies, music, all around the world, from Africa to Asia to even many parts of the Mideast. People say they like this stuff. When we ask about our technology, they say we really admire it and we like it. On the other hand, in every country we surveyed of the 44 nations, majority of the people told us there's too much America in our country. So there's this push-pull. We're constantly pumping out what we do, showing the goodies that we have, but the publics all around feel they're being Americanized, and globalization is it. I'll end quickly by saying that there's also a values gap. You've probably heard a lot about Europeans being for Mars and Americans being for Venus, and we think differently about things. And our surveys, and I hope you do get a chance to show them, do find that Americans and Europeans do have different values when it comes to religion. For example, we're the most religious rich country in the world. And in fact, we're the only religious rich country in the world. And on the other hand, Europe is extremely secular. We're closer to the Muslim countries in terms of the importance Americans place on religion. We also feel more personal empowerment. We're less in favor of a social safety net. We're much less in favor of government. Americans like their individualism. They bridle at government to a far greater extent than do people in most parts of the world, especially in Europe. There's two things to keep in mind about the value differences between us and the Europeans. One, They are the value gaps are no greater than they were a dozen years ago. This is the second series of surveys that I've done in Europe about values. The first one I did in 1990, and the gaps are equally large. They're not greater. Secondly, people around the world acknowledge, and Europeans in particular acknowledge, that there is a value difference between Europeans and Americans. The German Marshall Fund, which has conducted a very good survey, found this. But when we ask people, what's your problem with America? Is it a difference in values or is it policies? They say it's policies. Certainly our value differences may exacerbate problems with policies. When Bush talked about an axis of evil, that really probably got up the nose of secular Europe because they don't like the concept of evil, the way it's not as accepted as it is in the United States. And freewheeling Americans are much less likely to want to see constraints on its national power than are Europeans. But basically, it's not about values, say the results of this survey. It's about policies. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
From Oxfam.
I don't have any numbers, but I'm going to use the podium anyway. My brief this evening is to comment on the perspectives of NGOs and civil society on the debate about anti-Americanism, and offer maybe a perspective from developing countries. Maybe to sort of frame that set of remarks, I'd like to remind us that it's only 2 weeks since the WTO meetings collapsed in Cancun, and the editorials attributing blame are still actually out on the street and circulating. Letters to the editor abound in most of the international press. And amusingly, Robert Zellick and the U.S. Trade Representative staff are on the streets in Washington, D.C. arguing that NGOs brought down the talks. Not the failure of the U.S. or the EU to bring credible and substantial bargaining positions, not the new, tough, and well-orchestrated negotiating blocks of major developing countries, not the undemocratic or unwieldy governance structure of the WTO itself, but NGOs. What do we make of such an assertion from the chief negotiator of the world's most powerful government and economic power? I think what we have to conclude is that Mr. Zellick, in addition to covering his political back, is acknowledging that there is something more powerful at work in the streets outside the meeting halls than just a handful of colorful anarchists throwing chairs through Starbucks storefronts that we saw and dismissed 4 years ago in Seattle. What I would like to argue is that what is happening is that global civil society is coming of age and is making its presence felt, and that this is one of the most important unreported news stories of the last 20 years. While polls have their place, and I'm an avid reader and follower of all of Andrew's work at Pew, I think after hearing of such poll numbers, we as the public tend to see the world as a big primordial soup of people with radically shifting perspectives with whom we feel little connection or kinship. Most importantly, we see little order and structure and institutional voice that we can relate or connect to. What we are often shown beyond our borders are the protesters at these international events like Cancun, who are roundly dismissed in a throwaway line as globophobes, anti-globalizers, anarchists, and radicals, etc. They become the symbols for all that opposes what America wants and stands for. But is that the whole story? Is that what is really going on out in the street? Or is there something deeper happening? I would like to posit that there is a deeper story. The story is that over the last 20 to 30 years, there has been a slow and steady emergence of local and national social development organizations all over the world. Many began as small social service delivery agencies, others as human rights groups, others as women's support groups, others as environmental advocacy groups, others as labor action associations. The origins vary substantially. The fact is that with the spread of democratic governance throughout much of the globe, such groups have emerged and play very important roles, even in the most resource-scarce societies, in framing debates on a whole range of national issues. And in countries with limited technical capacity, these groups often fill out the ranks of delegations attending international meetings, and often are the only folks with the technical expertise to assist their diplomats to frame appropriate responses on critical questions. For many years, these groups operated in isolation from one another, competing for scarce resources. However, through the 90s, with the succession of UN summits, these groups began to leave their national territories for the first time, meet counterparts from around the world, establish incipient international linkages, and build broader understandings of public policy and global justice. With the explosion of Internet use, these groups have been able to stay connected, coordinate programs, define common advocacy agendas, coordinate global campaigns, strategies, and tactics, examine the linkages between their local issues and global policies, and build an incipient popular global campaigning force. This process has relied largely on the initiative of very creative social networkers who have built elaborate webs of social relations linking associations around the world. In many ways, these groups have used the very tools of the globalization process to build an alternative social architecture focused on human development needs and ends. Through the 90s, the emerging debate on global trade and globalization suddenly brought these groups together in ways that have never happened before. The real story in Seattle was not about the 200 anarchists tossing furniture. It was about the other 60,000 people in the streets making common cause, educating themselves, linking their institutions, and building a common agenda. Church people, unionists, feminists, environmentalists, and human rights activists. While the trade negotiators debated small print, the streets were filled with people participating in massive meetings running all day and into the night on a wide range of subjects and building a common value set. For these folks, the old model of governance were breaking down. The so-called social contract between the state and citizens on the national level was on the rocks and eroding quickly under the pressure of rapid liberalization. While the world was being thrust toward surrendering national sovereignty, shrinking the state, and accepting global standards and practice, there was no global government democratically elected who had yet the legitimacy to set these standards and define such sweeping policy regimes for all people in all places. For many organizations, the field of battle shifted in these last 10 years from the local community to the global stage. And linking the local to the global has become the new challenge for social movements all over the world. Despite their many differences, these groups began to realize they in fact shared many common values: a commitment to internationalism and multilateralism, commitment to equity, participation, transparency, and justice, commitment to humanitarian values, commitment to environmental sustainability, a commitment to democratic governance. And beyond this values convergence, a common language was emerging, a lingua franca that could bind them together despite their disparate national and sectarian interests, and that is the human rights discourse. Enter George Bush. While many of these groups had worked on issues through the 90s, the scale and intensity of the Bush withdrawal from the international system left many of these groups stunned and confused about how the U.S. was now going to choose to define its role in the world. Many of these NGO networks suddenly found themselves confronted with major challenges and setbacks to causes for which they had worked for decades: climate change, nuclear weapons treaties, women's rights to choose, international criminal court, just to name the obvious. While often small in scale, these groups and networks worked tirelessly to frame the debate in their countries on major global and national issues. And one by one, the Bush administration withdrew from treaty arrangements and openly disparaged and mocked many of the value premises underlying these initiatives. These groups began to retrench and reevaluate their future. And then 9/11 intervened. In the aftermath of 9/11, there was a long, respectful silence while many of these groups waited to see how America would define its engagement with the world in response to these events. Many hoped and expected a more aware America, a more community-minded America, a more statesman-like America, ready to build the kind of global institutions that would make for a better, safer world. They got something very different, something many of them had never seen before. They got an America shamelessly wielding its power, looking for a fight, abusive of overtures of collaboration, defining global security on its own terms. The sleeping lion had awakened and was on the prowl, and people became scared. What has this new America meant for the perspective of NGOs, North and South? If anything, it has intensified commitments to internationalist values and multilateral solutions. It has fostered unprecedented dialogues among often competing states over how to resist and restrain American power. Witness the G20 emergence at the Cancun meeting. It has shifted a wider spectrum of public opinion in many countries behind many, but not all, of the agendas of global civil society organizations. It has turned George Bush and the Bush administration into the icons toward which these organizations direct their energy. Meanwhile, the brand recognition for NGOs as a field, and particular NGOs, has surpassed major global corporations in terms of trust and respect on a global level. Lest I overstate the case or overly romanticize, let me make clear I'm not arguing global civil society holds all the answers. I am, however, stating that its existence is a social fact, that has been largely ignored, caricatured, and ridiculed, yet it continues to gain ground and adherence. I would further offer that within this world of global civil society, while there is perhaps a convergence on many values, there is a wide diversity of view on strategy, tactics, and solutions. It is not a neat and tidy universe where everyone agrees all the time, yet that's both its beauty and its strength. As is the case with most social movements, they are messy looking from the outside, but within them, if you look deep, there are some important truths and prophetic messages. My final point is quite simply that if we are genuinely concerned about anti-Americanism globally, it may behoove us to listen more carefully and seek out the energy within these social movements that respects and admires America and find the means to speak to that respect and admiration in new and creative ways. It may also require that we acknowledge that on many issues there is a growing global consensus about ways forward that are at odds with the narrow self-interest and ideology driving American political leadership today. The challenge before us is whether we as a people have the courage and humility to rise to this challenge, redefine ourselves and our national consensus in some fundamental ways that connects with many of the underlying premises of this emerging global consensus, while at the same time preserving much of what is important to us as a nation and as a people. This is a tall order that will require some sacrifice and some inspired voices and some leadership. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Raymond. And now to Michael Hirsch of Newsweek and Foreign Policy.
Stay seated here if you don't mind. These chairs are more comfortable than they look. I think anti-Americanism, to a certain degree, is inevitable. It's sort of the white noise of our world, the world we've done so much to create. The disparity in power, economic and military between the U.S. and the rest of the world is unprecedented and beyond what it was for ancient Rome or the British Empire of the 19th century. And so you just have to assume there is going to be a certain degree of resentment. But I believe, based on my reporting around the world and the book I've just written, that it is entirely manageable and does not need to be anything close to what it is now. And I believe as a result of that, mainly what we're seeing now is anti-Bushism. I'm a huge fan of Andrew Kohut's work, but unlike him in this case, I won't double think his respondents. And I think that mainly what we're seeing is a response to the policies of the Bush administration. I remember when I was a diplomatic correspondent for Newsweek traveling with Bill Clinton to Aachen, Germany in the final months of his term, where he received the Charlemagne Prize, which is the prize given to the leader who most promotes European unity. It's very much very prestigious in Europe. He was wildly popular in Europe, the very place about which we're now talking in terms of this vast transatlantic gap, and one side from Mars, the other side from Venus, and all such nonsense like that. It was clear that after 8 years of his presidency, in which there was a lot of bad blood, a lot of difficulties, Bosnia, Kosovo, American unilateralism was a term we heard back then as well. What you had was a president who was, in a variety of ways, was able to gloss over the differences, was able to find the common ground that Andrew referred to before in the poll numbers in terms of there being a kind of a communion of values, not exactly the same values, but enough of a consensus on basic values of open markets, freedom, democracy, and so forth. As Andrew said, there isn't. He did not find a greater gap most recently than he did 12 years ago. So, what is it about the Bush administration and its policies? That takes a little bit of history. It's hard to overestimate. I really think you cannot overestimate how much ideology, a basic set of ideas that this administration brought into power, has to do with what we're now seeing in terms of anti-Americanism. By that I mean a fundamental anti-globalism, not just anti-Clintonism, which was there, the so-called ABC foreign policy, anything but Clinton, but indeed a very active, proactive effort on the part of ideologues in the Bush administration to roll back everything about globalism and globalization. Do a nexus search of the senior members of the Bush administration, Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Condi Rice, and others, next to the word globalization, and you'll find almost no citations. It's a word they don't even like to see pass from their lips because it is something that they came into power effectively denying. This was a very conscious effort to, as John Bolton, one of the senior members of the Bush administration, the Undersecretary for Arms Control in the State Department, said to basically reignite what he called Americanism and turn back globalism. He said the Americanists have been sleeping while the globalists have been advancing, and by that he meant 80 years worth of Wilsonian institution building, treaties, conventions, the whole post-war system built on institutions like the United Nations and even the World Trade Organization. Senior members of this administration, including the president, but particularly people like Vice President Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, date from a very old, very hard right wing of the Republican Party that has resisted any attempts to build an international community. And this way of thinking was very much behind what you saw them do right out of the box, which was to reject, in no uncertain terms, the Kyoto Treaty, which the international community had spent 10 years negotiating, which was to declare that they were going to, withdraw unilaterally from the ABM Treaty and any other number of treaties like the Small Arms Treaty. And so you had, in the 8 months before 9/11, a real rollback and the beginnings of the kind of anti-Americanism we're seeing now. Now, what happened after 9/11? In spite of a lot of negativism out there about Bush, the toxic Texan was what he was called in one European newspaper account when he made his first visit there in the spring of 2001. In spite of that, you had an enormous upwelling of support and sympathy for the United States. 200,000 Germans gathered at the Brandenburg Gate, the now famous headline in Le Monde, we're all Americans today. Now that, true, disappeared rather quickly. I mean, it was a natural sympathy for the horrors of that day. But what you had after that was a very real and solid global consensus to root out the terrorists. You may remember for a period of several weeks after 9/11, what I call the Bush administration's multilateral moment, there was an enormous amount of support, not just abroad, but even here. I mean, even Democrats were saying, "My God, we're sort of glad these guys are in power now, and Gore is not. They seem to be doing and saying things right." And they were doing and saying things right for a moment. I think when things really began to go off the rails was at the end of December and early of 2001 and the early 2002 period, when we had really left the job in Afghanistan and Pakistan half finished. We had failed to roust out fully Al Qaeda and Bin Laden. They escaped through Tora Bora, the mountain redoubt where a lot of them went into Pakistan from. And it was at that moment when the job was half finished, and we still had enormous global consensus to root out terror, because after all, there was a sense among the major nations, and this includes France and the other European countries, that terror and anti-terror efforts were natural bonding agents for major states that are part of the international system. It was at that moment when the Bush administration wheeled around 180 degrees and said, we have to take on Saddam Hussein, and we have to do it now. We have to do it right now. And to a degree that really has not been well reported in the public, in the U.S. media, devoted most of its military and intelligence resources to taking out Saddam Hussein. Now, of course, what we're seeing now in the headlines over the last several months is the fallout from, I think, what has to be seen as a rather fraudulent turn in policy, in the sense that this was not an imminent need to do this. Now, why is that relevant to the subject of anti-Americanism? Because, frankly, it is this argument, the argument that this was an unnecessary war, that al-Qaeda was the target, that we're with you on bin Laden and not Saddam, was the single most repeated theme that we heard from the French and the other Europeans and the other places that we now consider to be focal points of anti-Americanism. But this was not a necessary policy. I mean, look at what the French, for example, were arguing in the UN Security Council last February. It was that this can be managed, particularly with the UN inspectors in there. So I think that what happened, the cost of Iraq is not just what we're reading about in the headlines now, the $87 billion, the lives of several American soldiers on average each week, but a tremendous and deep global consensus that was squandered in an effort to go after what has turned out to be, we have to honestly conclude, to be a rather something of a diversion from what the real target was, which was Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden, for which we did have widespread agreement. And the problem that I think the bottom line problem that we're now dealing with, because of the way this was managed and because the administration continues to be so unrepentant in its views, is that there is a sense out there among other major countries that this tremendous power that inspires such fear and a certain amount of resentment, but also a lot of respect, is being wielded in an illegitimate way, and that's what scares the world. That there was a basic understanding. There was one very striking poll result taken, I think, a couple of years ago by the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations and Marshall Fund poll, which showed that a substantial majority of people around the world, even in countries like Russia, accepted the idea of a one superpower world, which of course was just another way of saying, an indirect way of saying, they accepted the basic legitimacy of an American-dominated international system. That's what's being lost now, and that's what we're squandering with all of this anti-Americanism, this basic questioning about the legitimacy with which this power is being used. And I would just conclude my thinking on this by saying that the terrible irony, and I think the tragedy of where we are today, is that we ourselves built the system. We Americans had such a large hand in doing it. And to the extent that the anti-Bushism that I think we're perceiving out there extends to a certain anti-Americanism, I think it is because the American public remains unaware in its still, substantial support for George W. Bush and his policies abroad of the extent to which this international system that we built is being squandered. I sort of compare us as a country to, guests at a fancy party who were looking for an excuse to leave early, just dying to get out there without realizing it's their party. And that's kind of where we are. We built the United Nations and the World Trade Organization, the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, all of which are deeply flawed, but we built them for a reason. FDR and Truman and all of the post-war presidents subscribed to this basic consensus. And this is really what's being thrown out the window now by this administration in a very real and concrete way. And I think it's what the world is reacting to. So that's basically my diagnosis.
Wonderful. Michael Hirsch, thank you.
Thank you. Mike, my friend Mike Hirsch is a tough act to follow, as is my friend Ray Offenheiser, whose board I sit on. I haven't met Andy before, but it's a pleasure. But thank you. Since I've been back in the private sector the last 2.5 years, there have been a few occasions where it's been helpful to me personally to remind myself that I was not only a political appointee but a diplomat in the previous administration. And I think this is one of those occasions tonight. So I think I'm going to let my diplomatic discretion get the better part of valor and let Ray and Mike do most of the heavy lifting, commentary on the Bush administration's foreign policy. I think I'll stick mostly to business, but that's a rich enough subject now in the context of global anti-Americanism, to say the least. Let me begin by observing that whatever the extent to which anti-Americanism may reflect the substance of our foreign policy and the tone of our diplomacy, that its fallout really extends to all aspects of our position in the world, from the personal security of Americans at home and abroad to our continuing status as the most powerful cultural and economic force in the world. it's not a new phenomenon for American business to bear the consequences, for better or worse, of U.S. foreign policy or of international attitudes towards America. For decades, American business has been perceived by some to be the driving force, or at least the leading beneficiary of U.S. foreign policy, whether in Latin America, particularly in Guatemala, Chile, more recently in Mexico with the push for NAFTA, in Europe during the Marshall Plan years. That was considered by some, again on the left, to be a big way to open up market access for American companies. The whole drive for most favored nation status and opening up China and bringing it into the World Trade Organization. There's been a view that really on both the left and the right of the political spectrum, that American companies are prime beneficiaries of U.S. foreign policy. Whether that's true or not, I think one thing that's changed dramatically in recent months is that in many ways American business is absolutely anything but a prime beneficiary of the foreign policy environment that we're in today. In fact, I would argue that much of the collateral damage that's been the fallout of the war in Iraq has put U.S. business directly in the firing line. Ray referred to some of the anti-globalization movements, protesters from the mid to late 90s. Many of those issues, of course, continue. Focus on labor rights, human rights, environment, sustainable development, debt relief, poverty. And in many of those campaigns that continue now, still with great force and great emotion, business has been a prime target because of its own perceived actions and inactions, whether it's a perceived complicity in human rights abuses or inattention to the environment and sustainable development. What's striking to me about the current phenomenon of anti-Americanism as it's gained force and momentum over the last year is really the extent to which business is in the line of fire, not through its own doing, but really as collateral damage. We began to see this quite sharply, quite dramatically last winter and spring with the boycott calls against American companies in Europe as well as in the Muslim world, particularly in France and Germany, in Europe and in the Muslim world, not only in the Arab world, but as far as Southeast Asia, to Malaysia and to Indonesia. Websites went up identifying American brands and products that should not be bought anymore and identifying local alternatives or substitutes that instead should be. There were some physical attacks on particular American consumer franchises around the world, not only in Europe, but again in the Muslim world, as well as in South America. Very, very disturbing phenomenon, particularly the violence. Andrew's study points out, though, that a lot of the consumer boycotts have in fact subsided, and while there is still a inclination in certain countries, according to your study, to boycott American goods, Jordan was one example, I think, from the study, Indonesia another, that the boycott fervor is largely abated, at least in Europe, for the time being. And still, American brands reign supreme in the world. The most recent Business Week survey that came out about 6 weeks ago showed that once again 8 of the 10 most valuable brands on the planet are in fact American brands, and I think 62 of the top 100 in the world. But even if the collateral damage that we saw this calendar year in the run-up to the war in Iraq and during the war itself may be partly or largely behind us, I think there's still some real concerns that people in the business world in a whole variety of sectors still feel. There's still a continuing perception, again, whether it's true or untrue, fair or unfair, that American companies may be the intended or unintended beneficiaries of this war. There was renewed attention just this week to some of the issues regarding contracts and consultants with respect to the post-war reconstruction of Iraq. Those perceptions do not play well for American business writ large, nor for the United States of America, which is trying to put forward a view that it did what it did in Iraq for reasons of solemn national purpose, national security, and not out of economic interest. I think that there's some other reasons, though, why U.S. corporations still have cause for worry, even if our brand value, our brands remain supreme and the attacks and boycotts have abated. One is the reality of continuing security threats. You know, American business people travel all around the world. They're often the most visible faces of the United States around the world. Frankly, far more pervasive and visible than my former diplomatic colleagues who were holed up increasingly in fortress-like embassies with little access to local communities. Our business people, whether they're traveling or they're expatriates, are really the forward face for America, and they remain, you know, still very inviting targets, unfortunately, for anti-Americanism. There's always still the possibility of renewed consumer boycotts. There's a longer-term threat of diminished acceptance of American products and brands in some markets. Again, the ones I think that your study identified. Indonesia is a country that we put a lot of investment into, not only in the infrastructure sectors, but also in the consumer marketplace, anticipating the rise of a big new middle class. And now there's a growing disinclination to buy American there. There could be constraints on market access, particularly for public procurement sectors, where certain governments may be less inclined to buy American power generation systems or American aircraft or aircraft engines or big-ticket American-made medical electronics systems. There could be some political biases here. Finally, there's the chance from the business community's point of view, as distinct from the NGO community's point of view, that many nations, whether the European nations or those in the developing world, will be less inclined to work in accord with the U.S. government in what remains of the Doha round. There's a lot of antipathy toward the United States government, and again, U.S. business is taking some of the collateral hits. Let me just wrap up these opening comments by just observing that the stakes for American business in this whole phenomenon of anti-Americanism, this whole debate over anti-Americanism, are almost incalculable. The end of 2001, we had $2.5 trillion invested on the ground in facilities and personnel around the world. I mean, it's a staggering figure. So I think that American business has a lot to be concerned about. I also think that there are some things that American companies can do to help address this problem, and I look forward to contributing some ideas as the discussion continues. Thank you.
Thank you. Janet Freeman. Okay, so let's think about the solutions. What's sort of intriguing listening to all of this is that we could argue about the different causes and, you know, whether it's more Bush policy or more, you know, sort of unabashed power in the world. But even the U.S. government knows there's a huge problem. And I think the news today that this committee had come back from its research in the Arab and Muslim worlds and said, we have a major problem, we have a PR problem, we have a, you know, just an international relations problem that we need to deal with, and we need to pour money into public diplomacy, and we need to build libraries across the Arab world. Is that the answer? I mean, public diplomacy is one thing, but many or all of you have said U.S. policy itself is at the root of this sort of disjuncture. So I guess just take a stab at where you think the answer lies. And well, we don't have to go in order again. I mean, sure. Whoever wants to.
I don't, there have been discussions about, quote unquote, public diplomacy for quite a while, and that's basically, you know, doing good PR. At one point, the Bush administration hired Charlotte Beers, you know, a well-known ad person, Madison Avenue, to help burnish the U.S. image. It's all nonsense. It doesn't. There's no way that public diplomacy of that kind is going to make that much of a difference. All that makes a difference is what the president says at the Rose Garden of the White House, or what his senior officials like Rumsfeld and Cheney say in terms of setting policy. All of the diplomatic groundwork that is done by ambassadors and by PR people is not going to make a whit's worth of difference. If if the administration doesn't change, its basic approach to the rest of the world, which is to essentially ignore it as much as possible. Take dictation is the overall foreign policy approach of this administration, and that's what it essentially continues to be. It's slightly oversimplified, but not very much. So I think that I know this group that has come out with this report. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference, both in terms of its recommendations and because I'm sure the members of the committee recognize that it's not going to change the basic attitude.
I mean, to be fair to the committee and Edward Derigian, they are saying this has to be a strategic change right from the White House down, and behind that is almost implied you guys need to look at what your policies are doing. But it's still, I take your point.
It's just that I would make the distinction.
It misses the point, I guess.
Public diplomacy is not. Diplomacy is, of course, essential. Diplomacy is what is largely missing from this administration, but it's something. It's not. I guess the problem that I have is that too many people tend to see Bush as a president and a global leader who's his policies are basically right, but he's not a very good diplomat. He's from Texas. He's kind of a tough guy. When I think that, in fact, diplomacy, daily, assiduous diplomacy of the kind that we too rarely see, which is basically telling, even if you don't mean it, telling the rest of the world, look, we want you on board. What do you think about Iraq? So on and so forth, is absolutely written into his job description as president. That's what being a president of the United States means today, such as the disparity in power, the vast power that we wield. And I think that's what's missing. And so, to the extent that the report recommends that, I would agree with it.
Andrew?
Yeah, I agree with almost everything you said, Michael, about the ways in which the Bush administration has made things worse, not better. But I think that there's a structural problem here that we have to also take into account. And in the end, it boils down to how difficult it is to use this much power the right way. And let me say that, when we did a survey before 9/11 in Europe with the IHT, and we found that Bush had a 30% approval rating, Clinton had a 60% approval rating. Clearly, even before Bush got going with his war on terrorism, the Europeans said he's a quintessential American, he doesn't get us. And, walking away from Kyoto, the steel tariffs. 70% of Europeans know about those steel tariffs and disapprove. Americans know nothing about it. So, you're right. And Iraq was a juncture that most of the rest of the world would not have taken. But American public opinion was transformed by the 9/11 attacks. The American public in September of 2001 said, protect us and protect us now. We want something different. Public priorities for defense spending went to the top of the list. And any president would have been pressured to do something. And now this is where the rub comes in. Doing something with the Europeans is not a piece of cake. The Clinton administration struggled to get something going in Kosovo, and that's why they called it Madeline's War. And any president with this kind of dictum from the public, this kind of charge from the public, protect us, would have run up against a conflict with the Europeans about moving quickly. I did a survey in November of 2001. We had just routed the Taliban. And it was a survey of opinion leaders from all around the world, and they were already charging us with unilateralism. This is not an easy thing to do. I agree with you. The Bush administration has made this really worse and made it more difficult and squandered all kinds of capital. But I don't think we could just make a prescription that a better diplomacy, lack of the intransigence of the conservative wing of the Bush administration is a solution to the problem. I think it goes deeper than that. I think we don't know how to solve this problem out dealing with our power at a time in which we still feel threatened.
I just wanted to, I agree with you, Andrew, but I would just say that, diplomacy is always difficult. Consensus with the Europeans is next to impossible, but it has proven not to be impossible. I remember going with Madeleine Albright to the inaugural Community of Democracies meeting in Warsaw in 2000, which was remarkable. 107 countries and Hong Kong got together and decided that they all wanted to be democracies together. Again, the community of values. There was a Warsaw Declaration that came out of it. The country that didn't want to sign, France. France said, "Oh, this is too simplistic. It's so American. We don't want to, But the difference was, and the French are always a pain. It doesn't. This spans administrations and decades. There's no question about it. The difference this time around, the striking difference is that much of the world was with the French and not with us.
Yeah,
and that's where we went wrong. And to me, that is one of the singular indictments of the way the Bush administration has conducted its policy.
So, if that's where the United States went wrong, and the war has happened, and we're in the aftermath, I mean, what's the solution now? I mean, your sort of the position you stake out would suggest that elections are the answer. But I guess is there an answer in civil society? Is there an answer coming from business? I mean, are there other forces that can begin to work with the situation that we have to change reality and or perceptions? I don't know if you understand.
Maybe I'll take an initial try at that. Oxfam has connections and programs and outreach quite substantially here in the United States, and we actually run quite a number of focus groups. We're not as skilled at polling and focus groups as I'm sure Andrew is, but we make some efforts at it. And I think the thing that's been striking us since 9/11 in trying to talk to the American public is this sense of tremendous fear about security and where we go with that, and a tremendous amount of confusion about what are our options. I think one of the things that's really missing in our national public debate are really some forceful and well thought out alternatives that can drive a public debate about what policy alternatives are for security for the United States, particularly around, I think what Michael refers to in his book is sort of the hard power questions. In other words, again, as Andrew said, what do we do with power? I mean, in other words, the public, I think, to some degree, is in a state of mind currently where there's a bit of a sense that perhaps we should build higher walls. And yet the whole notion of sort of isolating the United States, building higher walls, pursuing what you might call the gated community theory of development, or foreign policy is not really an option in an era of globalization. If we're going to be an open society and we're going to pursue free trade and we're going to be interdependent, with the rest of the world in a whole series of complex relationships. So we've got to figure out a new way of relating to the world, managing our power in a complex set of relationships, and we've got to build public confidence that there are alternatives to what's happening now. And unfortunately, I think we don't have a lot of forceful alternative frameworks coming forward from leadership that are giving the public confidence. And I guess that's what I'm looking for. I think, just to put a plug in for Michael's book, I think he's taking a shot at it. But I think we need a lot more of that to drive the civil society discourse about these security questions in our own country.
Bennett, what do you think?
I think that, certainly the big foreign policy debate raging within the administration, particularly playing out between my former colleagues at the State Department and the Pentagon and the White House is, the unilateralists versus the multilateralists. I don't think that global American companies have the luxury of seeing the world in any other terms other than being for what it is. It's a multilateral and multicultural world. And if you're going to be a global company, you got to recognize that reality. You've got to deal with it. I think that there are three sets of things that global American-based companies can do. I think the first one is to be even more sensitive than they've tried to be toward the diversity of the communities where they operate, the cultures where they operate, their workforces around the world. I think, secondly, they can reinforce and strengthen their commitments to corporate social responsibility and some of the issues we've touched on in passing here, whether it's labor rights and human rights or the environment or sustainable development. And I think, third, that business leaders need to step forward in a far more focused and forceful way in the policy debate. I don't think that CEOs should spend a lot of their time being amateur foreign policy pundits, but I can think of several leading UK and European CEOs, who are really out there in very, very constructive and creative ways on major public policy issues that affect their company's business environments. I can think of some major U.S. CEOs from the 70s who played those roles. I can't think of any now other than guys who are no longer CEOs, namely Bill Gates, Ted Turner, and George Soros. And God bless them, they do spectacular philanthropic work, but it's different. I'm going to just develop one of these points for one more minute and then come back to the corporate responsibility theme that I think is really critical here. But, when it comes to this notion of how American companies can be both global and more local, I think that there are some things that we can do that are practical. We can adjust our product offerings and market strategies so that we can, be far more sensitive to cultural and religious sensitivities. It's McDonald's selling chicken tikka in Bombay. That's the easy part. The harder part is not replicating the mistake of Monsanto in misreading European attitudes towards genetically modified organisms and blowing a whole continent and almost losing their company in the process. Another example is stepping up local philanthropic efforts to reflect local concerns. McDonald's works with the Red Crescent, the Islamic version of the Red Cross in Saudi Arabia. Coca-Cola is working closely with environmental groups in Spain. One other thing I'll mention is I think companies can do a better job around the world, American companies, of listening to their workforces more, getting employees more involved, promoting more non-Americans to managerial and executive jobs abroad, promoting diversity in their workforce. And finally, and this is really important, it's intangible, but the way we do our business abroad, I don't think American business people can afford to be unilateralist in our business styles, our negotiating tactics. Maybe we ought to do a better job, if we can, of listening and learning from a lot of our business partners around the world. And maybe our professional diplomats can get a little bit of help from business people being amateur diplomats. And I think that's going to help the United States and American business in the long run.
I was sort of interested in jumping off that and asking Andrew, from your survey results, it sounds as if, correct me if I'm wrong, but that American business isn't that much of a problem. American business seems to be feeling the effects of this, and yes, they have to be very careful to be diplomatic in the ways in which Bennett has described, but people generally like big corporations overseas, don't
Well,
they?
I don't know if they like big corporations, but they certainly like American products, and I think that the boycotts were, except in the Mideast, relatively short-lived protest, just as in the United States, not buying French things really didn't go very far. I don't think that the issue of American products is I think that American companies in the end will have to deal with the criticisms that and concerns that people in the developing world have about the negative side of globalization. But it's not so much a sense of corporate responsibility as a sense of what are the rules that are going to govern the planet with regard to these things.
Back to it's hard to stray very far from the policy question when we're talking about trying to reverse this trend. And it seems as if when we're talking about the big jump in negative opinion about the United States, we're talking about recent events in Iraq, and we're also talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, at least as far as Muslim opinion is concerned. Is there one single thing that the American government could do that would drastically change views of America?
Well, if you look at the surveys that we've done and others have done, the view is so much, even as I was saying, among the Kuwaitis who support us, that we're not being even-handed, we're not serving as an honest broker in the Mideast. That notion, more than anything else, has created tremendous hostility toward the United States, and some success in peace and bringing the Israelis and the Palestinians together in a way that makes it seem like we want this to succeed, and we're not merely defending the Israelis. But I have to give you a little perspective on what our survey showed. While only the Israelis look upon the United States as a reliable ally in the Mideast. When we asked 9 Muslim publics whether they thought Israel could coexist with Palestinian rights, and we were very careful about the way we worded that question, in every one of those countries, majorities said no. Large majorities said no. And that's a measure of the degree to which these people are really on both sides are over the edge in terms of making an accommodation there. This is not an easily solved problem.
No, and the other thing is what is the implication of making policy to please people? I mean, then you get also caught in that. What's your national interest? What's global interest? How much do you cater to the kinds of dips in opinion we're seeing now? Michael, you look like you want to say something.
Well, I think that obviously this has been an intractable problem. It was one for Bill Clinton in the end, despite all the time he spent on it. But the lack of engagement of the Bush administration in the problem for the past 2.5 years, and the way that ultimately it kind of stuck one toe in with the roadmap, and by attempting not to deal with Arafat, to prop up Mahmoud Abbas more recently, has I think exacerbated the problem. No one likes Yasser Arafat. Okay, not even the other Arabs. But as recent events have confirmed, he continues to be the leader of the Palestinian people. And quite frankly, this administration, as a way of staying disengaged from this issue, and really ignoring the fact that this was helping to worsen Muslim views of the U.S., has decided that it would simply pretend that he was not the leader of the Palestinian people. And that has led us to where we are right now, which is they have, the roadmap seems all but dead, and they have no one to negotiate with since Arafat has just managed to install an entirely pro-Arafat Palestinian cabinet. So I think that has certainly made things worse. That's not to say that even in the best of situations, particularly post 9/11, it would have been manageable. But I do think 2 years worth of ignoring the issue while Sharon went on and built up more settlements has certainly made it a lot worse.
Does anyone want to comment, since we are sort of surrounded by communications professionals and in the School of Communications, just on whether the nature of media today helps or exacerbates this problem? I mean, we saw a lot of sort of, round-the-clock coverage of the war and different versions of propaganda and nuance. And I'm curious, when you think about this whole phenomenon of anti-Americanism and how it's measured and how it's transmitted, just any thoughts on that question?
Well, I think one of the most important things to recognize is that global public opinion and regional public opinion is now a player in the way people feel about the pressures that people bring on their governments and their leaders, because the satellite technology and the satellite cable channels all around the world are providing ongoing views in real time of the problems of the war in Iraq, or the debate about the war in Iraq, or concerns about Iran, and we've got an echo going that's comparable to this in much of the world. That's comparable to what we used to call the CNN effect in the United States in the 1990s. I mean, Muslim publics listened to Al Jazeera and other Muslim Mideast cable outlets, and they have a new vantage point on things that reinforces and creates public opinion in a way, and spreads ideas in ways that were unthinkable 10 years ago.
I'm just curious how many people during the Iraq War managed to turn on BBC or Canadian broadcasting to watch news accounts of the war. How many people thought that when they were watching, say, a BBC broadcast, thought they were watching a different war than the one occurred on American TV?
Yeah.
I think that one of the reasons that we're having these discussions right now is because the utter lack of a debate in the United States, really, about these issues. The Democrats have been AWOL for the most part. Many of them signed on to the Iraq resolution. It's not just about Iraq. They've been very tentative. What Bennett was referring to, all those stalwart voices of the late 90s, the global corporations that were, setting up codes of ethics and were going to be the new centers of power in the transnational age. What happened to them? The dot-com bubble imploded, and that was the first thing to go from their budgets. They've been absent. The public has not been engaged. And the media, my colleagues in the media, have, I think, rather, blindly signed on. There was, I think, a natural tendency right after 9/11 to cut the administration a lot of slack. You want strong leadership. And so there really hasn't been a debate. And I think it's only very recently that we've seen the media in its intensive questioning of the premises for war, questions about WMD, the intelligence, that we're seeing the media sort of get back to normal a little bit and start to get back to its skeptical self.
Yeah.
Just one other point that I was reminded of, and this is the flip side of this, but Edward DeRegion, who headed this committee on public diplomacy that gave its report today, said on our air that there are only about 5 Arabic speakers in the U.S. government capable of fielding an interview on Al Jazeera, which there's sort of 50 at the top level of language, but they're not actually put out there as public faces of, and I don't know if that rings true to you, Bennett, but I thought it was extraordinary in terms of
it does ring true
one
to me.
facet of
we had plenty of Russian speakers throughout the whole Cold War, and one would have thought that given 5, 6 Arab-Israeli wars over the last half century and the taking of the hostages in Tehran in '79, that we would have put a similar investment in Arab speakers. I mean, I'm friendly with the guy who you see in the pictures with, the U.S. president, whoever it is, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, who's been the interpreter in all the meetings with Arafat. He's a terrific guy. I don't think he has any backup. I used to travel around with him, been with him to Cairo and Amman and Damascus, and Gamal is it. I can't think of more than in my 8 years in there of having run into more than a couple Arabic speakers. It's a real problem, and I did see the piece in the Times this morning, and the report is timely, and I think that some of the recommendations are very, very solid and useful. But I do have to say, though, at the end of the day, the public diplomacy is less significant than the substance of the foreign policy, and we need some work on that as well. I will say one other thing about the Middle East, and that is, I've got my own views on it, but I was, despairing first couple of years that the administration, as Mike pointed out, was not really pushing the parties. But this roadmap was a serious exercise, and I knew it was a serious exercise when about 6 or 7 weeks ago the White House let slip the phrase loan guarantees, which played back into Bush 1, which infuriated the Israelis at the time and some in the United States. I do think that they were serious. My own view, for what it's worth, is that Sharon and Arafat are psychologically and politically incapable of reaching a deal, and there will not be a settlement until both have passed from the scene. I hate to be a pessimist, but that's my take on it.
I think we should turn to your questions if you have them. There's a roving mic, so put up your hands. And I would just ask that you keep the questions short to the point, and we'll try to do the same in our responses, and then we can fit more people in. And at the end, I'll have each of the panelists just have a parting shot.
Yes.
And we'd love to know who you are if you feel comfortable
It's
identifying
Michael
yourself.
Hager, Conflict Management Group in Cambridge, and I sense from the speakers that the issue is less communication than foreign policy itself. But I recall an editorial in the Times last week talking about the bubble presidency, and I'm wondering if the real communication issue, the real public relations issue, needs to be inward in terms of bringing some of the facts to the attention of the policymakers so that they can understand some of the consequences of what they're doing. I'm also recalling Bennett's statements about business. I'm wondering how the business community, given the fact that it is suffering collateral damage, is able to continue to support this Bush administration.
Who wants to tackle that?
I could have counted on my friend Mike Hager for a tough question. I'm not going to touch that last one, but I other than to say that one could make the argument that the Bush administration's foreign policy is not wonderful for global corporations that need to have a welcome mat around the world in every region in the world. I will say that and leave it at that. I mean, business does care a lot about stability. It cares a lot about access. And I think that there's probably some concerns. But I wouldn't hold my breath waiting for CEOs of any major corporation to take a shot at this administration on foreign policy or, frankly, on much else. They don't see that as their job, nor do I think it should be their job. But maybe somebody else wants to comment on the other point that Mike raised, Mike from the audience, Mike Hager raised on the information point.
I would add one point. I listened to a briefing by 3 former CIA, high-level CIA people who were reflecting what they were hearing from their former mates, and they were talking about the degree to which this administration was quite different from past administrations, where the effort here is so much top-down in soliciting intelligence rather than bottom-up, and that the administration wants to know, has a tendency to want to know what it wants to know, as opposed to listening more broadly to the reports that come up the chain. And I think it speaks to that briefing spoke to me the Times editorial.
Another question?
From Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. The U.S. has always been, at least in Brazil, but I can say in most of the foreign countries, a symbol of liberty and freedom. Brazil was a dictatorship for many years, and when people moved to the States, would say that they were escaping to freedom, because the U.S. has always been a symbol of freedom and something that we looked up to, not only regarding the culture, the music and films and that stuff, but human rights and stuff. But as I see it, and this is I can feel in Brazil, and I think the survey indicates the anti-Americanism after the Islamic countries. Brazil is right up there. At least this was what was in the press in Brazil. But anyways, my thought is that first the anti-Americanism started with a great disappointment when we saw that the liberty and human respect started not being respected by the American policymakers. Now we have examples in Guantanamo Bay of teenagers incarcerated with no access to lawyers, and there are many examples in Venezuela when an attempt of a revolution started. The U.S. was the first country to back this attempt to revolution, even disregarding Chavez was democratic.
Try to phrase your thought as a question, if you can, because that will generate.
So my question is, wouldn't the solution to this issue that we are living now be the policymakers to start respecting or treating as equals the other countries? I don't see that happening now, so I think the solution would be that. I want to comment on this point of view.
What would that mean, to treat other countries equally in the context of the power relations that we've described? I mean, I guess...
A revolution.
I would say the panelists agreed with you mostly. But
administration. Well, I also... I go into my book a little bit about this, not the picture, but what the Bush administration is doing. I mean, there's a reason why the Bush administration continues to have such broad support, though it's declining. They've tapped into a very old American sensibility, which is a sort of, us versus them approach to the rest of the world. I mean, this goes back to the very foundings of the Republic. Washington and Jefferson warning against entangling alliances and getting involved with those unsavory Europeans and so forth. I mean, it's a very, very old attitude that was kind of set aside during the last half century or so of engagement. World War II, the post-war situation where we immediately had to deal with the Cold War and the Soviet Union, so we were fully engaged. This administration was, in some sense, the first sort of deeply conservative administration to come to power in more than a half a century that was allowed to act on these very old impulses, which was to, reassert American sovereignty and our right to act as we please, and not to treat the rest of the world in effect as equals. Because we've always had this, American exceptionalism. We've always had this sense that we're an exception among the long history of nations. I mean, one of the poll results that came out was how more Americans regard themselves as superior to other cultures even than the French, amazingly enough.
For different reasons.
But so I think what I'm saying is that for Americans, this takes a lot of work. We have to have a basic reckoning with the idea that we built this international system and that there are now more things connecting us with the world than there are separating us. And that really requires overcoming 2.25 centuries of this exceptionalism. And we're not even close to getting there yet. But I think we have to get there at some point. I think we really need to work toward a new consensus which accepts the international system and its institutions as part of our system. And I'm not sure that this administration is up to doing it, frankly.
I would just add one thing, and that is I agree with all of what Michael said in a general sense, but with regard to Latin America, particularly South America, Brazil and especially Argentina feel so economically disadvantaged by the United States, and that's a particular problem and a particular set of attitudes that exists there with regard to us, which is different than European problems with us or Muslim problems with us.
Raymond, were you going to say something?
Well, just on the issue of sort of respect and equity and as a kind of a concept in international relations. I think the whole recent trade debate was an interesting scenario in which a lot of the rhetoric that we hear here in the United States from the U.S. administration is about even playing fields and fairness and change the rules and open your doors and free trade will sort of address your problems. And I think what, to some degree, happened in that meeting, which was a bit of a shock for the U.S. and EU negotiating teams, is the mirror was held up, and we were looking at ourselves in the mirror and looking at our free trade rhetoric in light of tremendous subsidies and a whole range of unfair trade practices that we were claiming didn't exist, and telling our own populations don't exist, and yet we're selling sort of a free trade gospel overseas. And again, this is an issue that for Americans, a bit like the discussion of sort of